Well, Cheryl, thanks for jumping into the fray today. It's great to have you.
Good to be here. Thanks, Mark.
I have been admiring your work for many, many years, back when you were at CNN. I don't even think I've told you this in person, but I think I watched you way back when, and have followed your incarnations over the years in various places you've been. But it's just great to have you here. And when I think of you, I often think about you just have a way of reporting on things, and sometimes you get yourself in trouble, and the government is tracking you, and you have problems with your employers, and you just seem to follow the news and wherever it takes you, and whatever the consequences. Is that a fair assessment of your work?
Well, I think so. I mean, I like to think that I'm undeterred by the influences that try to have so successfully managed the news. It became even harder, I think, for everybody around the 2005 time period, beginning with Big Pharma's influence. And then it's continued with, I think the advances of social media have allowed these people who want to instill narratives, it's allowed them an easier way to coalesce the narratives and control the thought and censor people who aren't on the narratives and controversialize them. I think that just opened all these doors to this kind of crazy place we're at today.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you were, I was at CNN from 92 to 94, but I was in the LA bureau. Was that about the time that you were at CNN?
Yeah, I was there from the very end of '89. I think I got there 2 weeks before Iraq invaded Kuwait.
Right.
And so I finished a 3-year contract there in '93.
Okay, so there was a slight overlap, even though I didn't meet you. But I mentioned that because I always thought the CNN operation was so interesting. The anchors had the tiniest little office spaces, little booths in LA, and I thought, man, shouldn't this he or she deserve like a normal office and a tiny cubicle? And was that just the way that Ted did things?
Well, I had a nice office, but I never used it because it was up on some floor and I was always in the newsroom.
Right.
But yes, I mean, Ted Turner, this was just a way of doing business at the time that's so foreign probably to people now if they weren't part of that. He's an extremely liberal guy,
Right.
but there was no question that we were expected at CNN to be fair and unbiased. I mean, it wasn't even like we had to have a talk about whether we would be or whether we would offer comments and opinion. We just understood these were the times. You don't do that. So even with progressive and liberal bosses, which I've mostly had over the years, I did a lot of very fair, unbiased news that those bosses liked because that's how the environment was until it started to be so managed the way it is. But yes, as far as the small offices, Ted Turner was always known for wanting CNN to be about the news, not trying to make the anchors stars. And I was perfectly fine with that. I think Lou Waters, one of my co-anchors, the one I sat next to for 3 years on one of the programs, I believe he told me when CNN first started, there was some thought that the anchors would not give their names on
Oh,
the air. And eventually, I guess it was decided they would, but that's how the thinking was. And I think Ted Turner was very forward thinking, not to deviate too much, but there was no 24-hour news back then. And if you polled people, there's a story being told that when people were asked, would they watch a 24-hour news network, like 0% said they would.
right.
But it took a visionary to understand people don't necessarily know what they want or what they would watch. And Ted Turner gave it to them.
Yeah, I was literally just starting out. I was 2 years out of college, and I just remember people that I would watch on the news that I was suddenly in the newsroom next to, like Casey Wyans and I think maybe Robert Vito and others, and they literally, had this little cubicle, and I'm thinking, man, all my dreams of journalism were like, this is what I'm going to end up with in a cubicle. But it was a great experience. I anchored the news in Japanese, so it was very, very strange. I had to read a Japanese teleprompter. Which was
Did you have a big office at least?
No, I didn't. That's a whole other episode. But
Uh,
anyway, I think that one of the characteristics of your journalism is I couldn't really tell, and maybe to this day, I couldn't exactly tell where you were coming from. I think that's the sign of a great journalist, that I don't know whether a person is on the right or the left or whatever. I think of Jan Crawford, who covers the Supreme Court, and others. There are a few that I can't quite always figure out. And I mean, isn't that the sign of a good journalist, that the viewer, the reader can't quite always figure out where they're coming from?
well, I think so. I mean, I consider it, and I was not always probably, I was very non-political. I didn't even know what it meant to be a Democrat or a Republican when I graduated from college. I was asking people, well, what's a Republican? What's a Democrat? So I didn't come from a partisan viewpoint, but I probably made mistakes early on. I know I made mistakes early on, sort of adopting and accepting narratives that were sometimes maybe political in nature. And I was in very liberal newsrooms without understanding that was the case, and taking on certain viewpoints and biases and stories that you're not really intending to do just because of the atmosphere. Once I started to figure out what was going on, not just with politics, but with other biases, I started to consider it like a really cool challenge to keep my own opinions out of things as much as possible, unless I have some special insight. As an investigative reporter, occasionally I become a subject matter expert on something, not very often, but on something I've dug into. Short of that, I try very hard to present different viewpoints. I have found that I've dug up better stories when I've listened to somebody that differs completely with what I originally thought as a reporter. I think we get so dug into our own viewpoints, go out and do this story, and we think we know what the story is about. And anything that's contrary to our preconceived notions, we just sort of edit out, looking for basically to write something we think. And think about how silly that is. When you're a young journalist, you don't know anything yet. So you're trying to present to people something you don't know much about, but you're acting like you're the expert. So once I started to understand all this, I discovered it's a fun intellectual challenge to report something either you don't agree with in a way that people may not know that, or to let different sides be heard in a rational way when you feel strongly, perhaps personally, about something, but people won't really figure out, how you feel. I think that's a fun challenge, and that should be taught more in journalism school, especially today. Instead, they're being taught to insert opinions and biases in many instances in their news reporting.
Was the family you grew up in pretty apolitical then? It sounds like it was.
Yeah, I don't know where my parents stood on politics. Um, my mother has since, she's 88 years old, she's described herself as a Republican. She acts like a Democrat in terms of the things that she supports and likes. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure she knows what it means to be either one. But yeah, there were no discussions at the dinner table about this sort of thing. And then at CNN, I still don't know where my on-air colleagues stood. I sat next to Lou Waters for 3 years, and to this day, I can't tell you if he's a liberal or conservative. We didn't discuss that. It's not like we were avoiding it. It was just a different world. That was not part of the daily newsroom discussions.
Your 88-year-old mother, what does she think about Donald Trump? I'm just curious.
She thinks he's rude. I don't think she's a huge fan. I think she said she voted for him in the end, but she's always, again, she says she's a Republican, but she's asking questions coming from things a lot of times from a Democrat viewpoint when she asks about the news or talks about the news. In the end, she may have voted for him, but I think she doesn't like his style.
And where did you grow up?
Sarasota, Florida.
So you're back in your home state, basically.
Yes, I still work in DC, but I live in Florida.
Mhm. And just for the viewer, the uninitiated viewer, would you go through just the trajectory of your career? You ended up fairly quickly at CNN, and then where did you go from there? And just walk us through it.
So out of college, I worked 3 years at WTVX, the CBS station in Fort Pierce, West Palm Beach. Then worked a short time Columbus, Ohio, CBS station local, WBNS. Then the CBS station at the time in Tampa, Florida for 3 to 4 years. That was WTVT. Then CNN for 3 years. And then CBS starting out in New York, but ultimately being assigned to Washington, D.C. as an investigative reporter. And simultaneously, for maybe 5 or 6 years, I worked for PBS anchoring a health news magazine while I worked at CBS too. And now I'm going into the 11th season at Full Measure, my independent national TV show, where, by the way, we have more viewers than I ever had at any of those other places. It's a very successful show in the viewership, whereas a lot of news organizations are losing viewers. You keep hearing about that. We are frequently up 20% or 50% even from the year before in our viewership, which is climbing.
And that's with Sinclair?
Yes. And I think it's because we're doing a lot of good old fashioned reporting like people used to see before this climate that you and I are talking about. People are thirsty to hear something. half of our, about a third of our viewers describe themselves as nonpartisan or, something other than Democrat or Republican. And then about a third are Republican, a third are Democrat. And I frequently hear from Democrats say, they're thirsty for this kind of information. It's a lot of accountability stuff that Democrats want to see, but what's called the mainstream news won't do anymore if it's watchdog journalism that goes after Democrats, for example, under the Biden administration. You wouldn't see them doing that. We did that. We also do watchdog journalism against and of Republicans, as I've always done. So I think there are a lot of people that want to see that kind of reporting that just sort of goes where the story is.
Yeah, do you consider yourself a Gen Xer?
I don't even know what that is. I always hear that. I don't know what X, Y, and Z. I don't know what they are. I'm 64 years old. So
Well,
you tell me.
never have asked you your age, Cheryl, but since you're volunteering it.
That was a sneaky way of doing it, I guess.
Right. No, I think you're.
I think I'm a baby boomer. I think I'm the last year of the baby boomers, someone told me.
Yeah, I think you're on the cusp of. But the reason I ask is I've really been thinking lately about I think there's something about the Gen X-ish group that we don't wear a uniform. We're really open, I think, to whatever, wherever the truth is. If it takes you in this direction, takes you in that direction. It's not that there's no ideology, but it's ideology in service of something truthful, not just blindly following an ideology. And I was thinking back, I'm going to write something about this at some point, maybe for Newsweek. But when I was I think 10 years old, we were in California for a couple of years. I remember my teachers were saying all hell is going to break loose if this proposition passes, Proposition 13 at the time, which is going to cut property taxes. And my teachers said, if you come back next year, though, it's going to be chaos, and if your parents don't vote the right way. Well, I came back the next year after it passed, and property taxes were cut. And the only difference was we didn't get free pencils and free paper anymore. Remember clearly, I was lied to by the liberal side. Now, after that, the conservative side said, well, if we try to stop smog, we're going to ruin business, and it's the end of the world. And we did. The liberals did clean up the air, and we didn't have smog anymore. Anyway, I felt at a young age that both sides were not being truthful. They were exaggerating, and the truth was somewhere in the middle of those murky extremes. And I thought that's followed me through life. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of that too. Just one example would be with Dr. Fauci, and why do we? I want to hear Fauci, and I wanted to hear Bobby Kennedy. And somewhere in the middle of that, I would figure it out. But when one side said you can't hear one side, I was like, wait a minute, what?
Yeah, that's the tell. I mean, the idea of censoring somebody entirely, young people won't understand, is a relatively new phenomenon that wasn't said much inside newsrooms prior to the Big Pharma influence starting, I would say, again, around 2004, 2005 time period. I almost never, if ever, heard somebody say a side of a story shouldn't be told.
Right.
That whole system of where we now want people supposedly to curate our information and tell us what facts shouldn't be heard, or fact check things off the front, which we can't possibly know about. I mean, the most unqualified people and fact checkers are supposedly fact checking information in order to tell us what we can't hear. Right. And that's all driven by the big interests, the big money interests that have understood how to manipulate us and then influence the fact checking groups and the nonprofits and the journalism schools. I mean, they have their fingers and their money in all the pots that they understood. If they could start to control or influence them, it would change everything about the way we get our information, and it has. But yes, I mean, I think there was a time not all that long ago when you would hear people fight and argue that a certain side of a story should be heard. Great. But now it's turned into that side's not telling the truth, or that side shouldn't be told because it's irresponsible. That's all new to journalism.
Yeah, and I think this administration is very interesting, and I think it is kind of a Gen X administration. You have people, again, you have Democrats, you have Republicans, you have Tulsi Gabbard, Bobby Kennedy. It doesn't feel ideological so much as, I guess people who are pursuing the truth and don't really wear a uniform, if that makes sense.
Well, I wrote a Substack about that. I think I called it the Republicrat Party or something, or the Trumpicans, or, there's some mix going on that people are not firmly divided along the ideological lines that I think we traditionally saw them. Right. And as you already know, Bobby Kennedy differs very much from Republicans and from Donald Trump on some issues,
Right.
but they have found bigger overarching issues in the wake of the COVID emergency and the censorship that they agree upon, and they're okay to disagree on some other things such as environment, climate, whatnot, but they agree on what they think are what they think are bigger and more urgent things. So now, because the Democrats did not embrace the Tulsi Gabbard, the Bobby Kennedy, I mean, certainly Kennedy reached out to the Democrat Party and wanted to run as a Democrat, but was prevented from doing so, more or less,
Right.
because Democrats rejected that whole group. It's a pretty big group.
Right.
They've now kind of aligned with the Trump people, making that group even stronger.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think it's a fascinating phenomenon. I often, in conversations I have with my friends who are very, very anti-Trump, I think you're missing the point. It's not about him. It's this coalition that's forming around him that I find is so interesting. Who would have ever put Elon Musk and Bobby Kennedy and Tulsi Gabbard and J.D. Vance in this stew, Marco Rubio, whatever it is? It's such an interesting mix of people. And it's almost like each one has given a little bit, like the conservatives have told Bobby Kennedy, okay, fine, we'll care about cereal labels for just for you. And then he's saying, okay, fine, I'll give a little bit on abortion and become a little bit more moderate. And it's like everybody's given a little bit and met in the middle on things.
That's not bad. And I also don't think it's bad. I think it was kind of refreshing to hear Trump say at some speech he was talking about Kennedy, or maybe Kennedy said, or maybe both, we disagree on X, Y, and Z, and that's all right. Like, we agree to disagree. They don't have to come out and pretend they agree on 100% of everything with each other or fight behind closed doors. They're publicly saying, we don't agree on these topics. And that's natural. That's actually a natural state of being. So
what do you think would have happened if Bobby had run against Biden, been allowed to run against Biden in 2024?
The Democrat Party, even if he'd have been allowed to run, and I don't know if people know, they passed technical rules that prevented him from running against Biden. The Democrat Party did.
Right.
He could have eaten into the sort of the mainstream Democrat Party, but much like Bernie Sanders, the Democrat Party would not let that take hold. And they would have certainly attacked and controversialized him from within the party, particularly because of his Big Pharma stance, or stances that threaten Big Pharma. So he would have been, I think, very controversialized. And I'm not sure he would have survived. It takes, I'm not a political analyst, but it takes a lot of money and effort to stay in the race beyond those first, primaries and caucuses. And I'm just not sure how long he could have lasted, particularly with the deck stacked against him from within the party. And you may know the Democrats basically canceled the Iowa and New Hampshire caucuses and primaries the last two times by not counting them, or by ignoring them, or not counting them until bigger races came in, because they didn't bode well for Biden. Right. There was a time when if Kennedy had performed very well in one of those races, that could have made a difference. But the Democrat Party has made it where those early races that were not super pro-Biden wouldn't count or wouldn't matter. Bobby was right. They rigged the system.
Well, it is astonishing to think about it for just a second that two former candidates of the opposing party are in the cabinet of the opposing president. We take that for granted, but that's a pretty stunning development that I don't think has happened very often in history.
It is. And let's remember, Trump is not really a Republican in the classic sense of the word. People talk about him like he's a Republican or super conservative. He's not, never has been. That's just the party in which he chose to run. He could very well have chosen to run as a Democrat, but he ended up running as a Republican.
I think he almost ran for the Reform Party, on the Reform Party ticket, I think in 2000, maybe, if I recall correctly. Well, let's shift to talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is your reporting on vaccine-related issues, Big Pharma, and all these things, which I've followed very, very closely for my own personal reasons. As I said, I want to gather as much information as possible during this last period we went through. But you've been pretty, fearless or courageous or whatever you want to call it, on the reporting of it. Would you have been were you able to do that when you were at places like CBS and CNN, or is this because of your more independent stance that you can do that now?
I started doing it at CBS because I was assigned to do it. People may not know that in the early 2000s, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, before Big Pharma had such a big hold on the media, we were all reporting on these vaccine and medical safety issues. The LA Times was doing it. The New York Times was doing it. I was breaking a lot of stories. The other networks were doing it. It was not controversialized, or it wasn't even considered controversial to look at medicine safety issues that impact everybody. The idea that even the phrase anti-vaccine, if used at all, wasn't common until the narratives were pushed out by Big Pharma / government / these coalescence of groups. So I was assigned to cover vaccines initially with the restart of the smallpox vaccine program after 9/11. CBS had me cover that. I developed great sources. I learned so much because I never questioned the medical establishment. My dad's a doctor, my brother's a doctor. I never understood that scientific studies would be skewed or inaccurate, or that scientists would lie. I mean, I didn't know any of the things I know now. And then through that first story, I caught the government / military covering up the fact that David Bloom, NBC News correspondent, who died while being deployed with the troops in the war with Iraq, should have been reported as a potential vaccine injury or vaccine death because he'd had the smallpox vaccine, and it was being monitored in a very special way, like the COVID vaccine should have, because it was a pilot program that was restarting the vaccine. I broke the news that they didn't report his death properly, and as a result of my reporting, they did. But that's when I learned, wow, smallpox vaccine can cause myocarditis and side effects. I'd never even heard, I didn't understand the biological mechanism by which vaccines could even do such a thing. I always thought that was crazy. As I learned more and then dipped my toe further into things we're not being told, this whole vaccine and medicine story looked very much like all the other corporate and government scandals that I've covered, with whistleblowers and cover-ups and manipulation of information. And one of the best stories I've ever covered. So I became very intrigued, and CBS wanted these stories and assigned me to cover them for some years. Again, until there was this push me, pull you with the vaccine and pharmaceutical industry developing a partnership to advertise in the media in a way that they had not been allowed to do before, earning billions and billions of dollars for the media outlets that then began to get very squishy from a corporate level in reporting any of those stories, which was the intended effect, I think, of the partnership by the pharmaceutical industry. So we went from reporting very freely and openly on these very important safety issues to seeing them controversialized, and seeing the industry and social media attempt to controversialize the reporters and the reports and the scientists, to where we are now today, where most reporters at regular news outlets will self-censor because they understand that those stories are not wanted by the corporate bosses.
Is it an explicit thing, or is it just implicit?
It was explicit, but I argue now there's no longer any reason for someone to tell reporters don't do that story, because the reporters understand when they bring a lead, and many have tried, because I've spoken with some of them. This was a hard-fought issue for many years, with reporters still digging up great stories and sometimes pushing them all the way through to the end and having somebody come from the very top of their corporation and pluck out the story and not let it air or be published. So I think it's just well known. And then now you probably have newsrooms full of journalists that haven't done their own independent research and just buy into these narratives that have become so ubiquitous that say, oh, this is a settled issue, this is untrue. Well, that's not the case, but that's probably what journalists who don't do their homework are thinking, even if they wanted to report fairly on something.
What happened around 2004 that you mentioned that was a date? What happened around there at that time that sped this up?
Well, the pharmaceutical industry, as maybe people know, in almost nowhere in the world is allowed to advertise prescription drugs on television the way they're allowed to do in the United States. And maybe is Australia or New Zealand the only other one. But I learned after the fact, at the time when the news organizations were becoming squishy about these stories, that at that very time, the corporate lobbyists for the news organizations were literally partnered with the pharmaceutical lobbyists, going on Capitol Hill together to try to get members of Congress to ease restrictions on advertising so that these lucrative partnerships could be expanded. So they were expanded. And then around that time, you saw Congress also quit doing their oversight. The Energy and Commerce Committee used to do tons of oversight on vaccine safety and medicine safety. They don't do that anymore. I mean, they're very managed hearings. You won't they won't be allowed to talk about certain things. So all of that coincided with this time of this lucrative partnership where this advertising you see now on TV, for example, or even online, it's just practically all pharmaceutical industry stuff. They have, in essence, legally bought out media companies to ensure that those companies will not follow certain news trails that could harm the pharmaceutical industry that is basically responsible for the financial success of these news organizations now.
And is it true that the advertising is not so much aimed at getting you to talk to your doctor about something, but rather that it influences the coverage?
I think it's both because I have seen research. Yes, it influences the coverage, but some of the drugs, there's internal research that the pharmaceutical industry has done that says if they can simply get you that talk to your doctor, if they can simply get you through the door of the doctor's office, you are very likely to be prescribed the newest, latest drug that they've been lobbying your doctor to prescribe. So they know they just have to get your foot in the door and say, they don't even have to advertise their drug. They may say, there's an epidemic of sleeplessness. This is a true story. A nonprofit puts out a story, there's an epidemic of sleeplessness, but America just doesn't know it. Talk to your doctor if you're feeling sleepy or you don't think you're getting enough sleep. That was actually part of an advanced campaign bought and paid for by a company that was about to introduce a sleeping, basically a drug that helps you sleep better called Lunesta.
Right.
So behind the scenes, they're not allowed to advertise the drug yet or in certain ways, but if they can just get you into the doctor's office and say, I'm having trouble sleeping, by advertising on TV or wherever they advertise, they know they've done the hard work at the doctor's office, and he'll probably prescribe that newest, latest drug for you if you simply go in there and ask for help.
Wow.
Yeah.
We're in a new world in which, just as an example, just to pick on myself, before COVID, if my doctor had said, take 2 tablespoons of honey and stand on your head, I would do it, whatever he said. Post-COVID, I don't know who to trust anymore. I have to go to multiple sources to figure something out. A lot of assumptions are questioned now, cholesterol drugs or whatever. It's like we're in a brave new world where we don't know who to trust anymore. Do you feel that too?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had already arrived at that by covering these stories and learning what I did. I broke stories on statin drugs while at CBS News, the controversies, the cover-ups, the conflicts of interest with statin drugs.
Right.
But I think the positive thing, although it's led to a lot of confusion right now, the positive thing about the COVID mess is a lot of other people have gotten on board with understanding they should question their doctor's advice. In my book, Follow the Science, which is out now, I talk about how starting in medical school, doctors are being taught false information, provably false information about medical stuff, as well as they're skewed with what they should and shouldn't read and talk about with their patients and so on. But given false information influenced by the pharmaceutical industry, all the way through their continuing medical education classes where they're being given false or incomplete information in these classes they have to take to maintain their licenses, again, influenced by the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
So I don't think it's good that we don't know what to do when a doctor tells us to do something. But I do think after this transition period, maybe we'll have a more reliable, helpful medical system that instead of just treating the explosion of chronic diseases that our doctors seem to have just ignored or not noticed over the past 20 years, maybe we'll be getting to the bottom of some of these things and preventative things and so on as a result of people being understandably skeptical about the advice we've been given for the past decades.
And what kind of pushback have you received, if any, from the pharmaceutical industry?
None directly. I'm sure they're trying to, use tactics to controversialize me and to do things to make my reporting not be amplified or seen by as many people, but nothing personally one-on-one. One thing for sure, surprisingly, even so, Google, Facebook, Twitter, all those places were censoring my stories, even when they were just simply referring to a peer-reviewed published study on a controversy, because there are people assigned from the industry to watch the pages and the work of people like me, and then report the pages or report the posts to be looked at by fake fact checkers who don't even know what they're talking about, but to say that the stories aren't true or they're harmful. That's really impacted the reach of my reporting in recent years. So that's indirect. Now that it's been loosened up a little bit, they haven't been with Elon Musk at X. They they certainly down throttle some of those stories and posts, but they're not completely blocked.
Right.
But the one thing that didn't change, I don't really understand TikTok, but I got a TikTok account because I thought I should start to learn about TikTok in the last couple of years. TikTok is the worst censor. I simply put up readings from my book, Follow the Science, or I put up factual stories I've done from on Full Measure that are legally approved. There's no question that the information is accurate. And they not only censored that, in some cases, I have a lifetime permanent ban from TikTok without them telling me why or allowing me to appeal or tell them that whatever fact checks they use, the fact checkers don't know as much as I do about these topics. So I'm now permanently lifetime banned from TikTok. I believe that was a result of the pharmaceutical interests that, again, try to flag your account so that they can controversialize it and get a lot of reports about it and try to, limit the breadth of the reporting.
I mean, putting myself in the shoes of the pharmaceutical industry to have Bobby Kennedy essentially regulating you, this has got to be their worst possible nightmare ever.
It is. I think they're going to have to, right now, they're trying to figure out how to pick and choose what they do from the standpoint of the food. So on the one hand, I'm sure they're attacking them through whatever means they have that are not directly traced to them very easily, but they have all kinds of third-party things, tactics, and psychological operations they do. On the other hand, they're meeting with him and appearing to cooperate with him because some of the stuff is better compromised on or handled in that way than to have the hard hammer of Kennedy coming down on you if that's what he's going to do. I predicted, and I still think this is true, with the food industry, they've already improved food to some degree in other countries, taking out ingredients that they know cause cancer or cause chronic diseases and disorders and ADD and all kinds of stuff. I think rather than Kennedy's approach would be, for example, well, let's start by labeling the food better when you have these toxins, pesticides, toxins, poisons, whatever in it, ingredients. And I think the food companies, in many instances, will just change their formulation rather than have to put a toxic label on the food. So just the threat of Kennedy, I think, will bring about changes that have already happened in other countries. So I think there'll be some self-regulation of the industry that he won't even have to worry about doing. The vaccine thing is tough because the vaccine safety issue is regulated by a special court that the pharmaceutical industry lobbied Congress to create that exempts them from liability for vaccine injuries. That court now has been changed and massaged so that it's more and more beneficial for the vaccine industry and less so for the victims. I know that there needs to be an effort to change that, and that Kennedy understands that. They're really going to fight that tooth and nail to have to not give up their liability protection and not start trying to explicitly compensate autism. They do compensate autism cases when they come to vaccine court in certain cases if you don't say it's autism. If you say it's encephalopathy or just a general brain damage, even if the kid has autism, if you don't use that word, they'll get a payment in vaccine court. The trouble comes when you use the specific word autism. They don't want to pay that because that opens the door for millions of potential cases, and they don't want to do that.
Have you ever wondered how did Ronald Reagan, Mr. Free Markets and Free Flow of Information, how did he get talked into taking away giving liability protections to this industry?
I never thought about it from a Reagan standpoint, but that was during the Reagan years, wasn't it?
It was.
I was always told that. So I think information is
That's such an anti-free market posture.
Let me explain a couple things. A lot of the information is stovepiped by industry people who surround themselves, like Reagan was probably surrounded by people who, in essence, in some way kind of worked in the industry's interest. So was Donald Trump in some cases, particularly during his first term.
Right.
But this whole protection from liability was sold to the public and to Congress. Congress knew they were doing it because they're getting donations from the pharmaceutical and vaccine industry, but they had to present a reason to the public. The reason given to them by the vaccine industry was there were a ton of brain damage cases coming through the courts from the DPT vaccine. I think the industry, which measures these adverse event reports from vaccines and gets them before the rest of us, they saw the autism trend coming because it was just about to come. The court was established just in time to protect the industry from the autism wave of claims that were coming related to vaccines. So there were also parents that were being very aware of the brain injury cases that were going on. We're talking in the 80s and early 90s, where this stuff started to explode. The industry went to Congress and said, if you don't protect us from liability, we're going to stop making your vaccines, and infectious disease will come back because we can't handle all these cases that are coming through court. You can't do this to us. So the compromise, or at least what the vaccine industry wanted, what Congress agreed to, was a special court that would compensate people who are vaccine injured, but it's very hard to prove your case in the court. And it's also when the victim gets paid, it's not from the vaccine industry. So there's no incentive financially for them to come clean about their injuries or try to avoid them, because when you get paid, if you're vaccine injured or your kid was, it's from a fund built with our money. Every time we get a shot or a vaccine, it used to be a quarter for each dose would go into a trust fund that pays the victims who are vaccine injured, so the industry doesn't have to bear any of the cost. And then even better for the industry, the victims do not get normal discovery, what's called discovery process in court. Normally outside of this special court, victims would be allowed to see internal documents that might show what the companies know about the injuries and how soon they knew that they were being caused. Now, through the special vaccine court, victims aren't allowed discovery in any traditional sense of any of the stuff, so they can't help other victims if they prove to be a vaccine injured case, which many have. Billions of dollars have been paid, but they don't have the evidence or the information from their trial to present to help other people who might also be vaccine injuries.
Yeah, because it's really a distortion. I mean, for a conservative Republican like Ronald Reagan, it's a distortion of the free market to exempt anybody from responsibility, right? I mean, it's just a basic.
Yeah, I was always told Henry Waxman was a very, very, very big player in all of this, the organized effort. And over the years, when I was covering vaccine court and the autism cases that were going through this omnibus proceeding, things would happen, and the special masters, they're not even really judges, but the special masters, and I had contacts there, would say things like, one in particular would tell me that politically somebody would reach down and make something not happen or change or make a ruling not happen. And I remember saying to him, who has the power to do that with a court that you would think is supposed to be independent? And he said one time, we in this court do not operate in a political vacuum. And he wouldn't tell me anything else, but there definitely is political influence on the vaccine court in ways that I don't fully understand, but I think that's always been the case.
Yeah, well, I know for the longest time, Bobby Kennedy couldn't get on any TV shows because of I think it was Roger Ailes just told him flat out, like, I'd love to have you on Fox News Channel, but I can't. And he couldn't get on a lot of shows. I remember he was telling me that there were a few that he'd get on, but most of he couldn't until he ran for office. Then they really couldn't keep him on, because of the civic duty. But it's interesting. The alliances are different. As you said, there's Henry Waxman. But I've always been just very curious about what those meetings were like, where they convinced Ronald Reagan to change, to remove. I mean, I guess I have a dim view of human nature. If you told airlines no responsibility for plane crashes, I think you'd have a lot more plane crashes.
Well, I assume that, they gave Reagan the safety argument, much like they told Donald Trump when COVID broke out that the deaths would be on his head if he didn't shut down, society. Obviously that didn't help, but he didn't have a way to know that ahead of time. So you have these conflicted, biased experts telling them, safety things. And I'm sure there were people telling Reagan, gosh, if we don't give them this exemption, then you're going to be responsible for infectious diseases coming back like we've never seen before. And you don't want to do that, do you?
Right. Where do you go for your medical guidance?
I have so many sources now I've developed over the years inside the government. There's a lot of honest, great scientists and experts who've served as resources for me. And I also know, this sounds simplistic, but it's worth saying. I looked at people who've been accurate about matters of controversy in the past. So no one knew when COVID happened who to listen to. I certainly talked to and very early interviewed Dr. Jay Bhattacharya on my program, Full Measure. I had sources at the US AMRID, the Army Institute of Infectious Disease that does all this research. I had some great sources. In retrospect, those guys were right and Dr. Fauci was wrong. So I would say I would not go back on future issues to Dr. Fauci and necessarily take his word, but I would go back to the people that proved to be accurate with the benefit of hindsight. That's just sort of kind of basic reporting and sourcing as well. At the end of Follow the Science, if people want to know where to begin, I'm sorry it's so much work, because they should be able to trust kind of what we're supposed to do that in the media, give them the shortcuts to understand or full information from various sides so they can make up their own mind. Absent us doing that well, there are some sources I'm guiding people to in the last chapter where they can start and try to see, flesh out those sources who did prove accurate about other things and at least get different viewpoints from them. A lot of those places have started to develop independent medical groups, independent resources, Substack places. So there are new places for people to go that want this independent information. And maybe some of my best advice is, as horrible as this sounds, is whenever there's a prevailing narrative, it's on all the regular news media and they're all telling you something that you should not believe the other thing or should not hear the other person, I instinctively take that to mean that that other viewpoint is not only worth listening to, but may actually be true. And also that there's a powerful interest working to control us so that we don't get that information. It makes me seek it out and give some credence to it, or at least consider that. And I think that's how people at home should look at it as well.
So you would say beware of any side that says something is settled.
Absolutely. I mean, I think
that's a tell, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, so in the forward or the little place before my book, I think I said, no scientist ever said no real scientist ever said science is settled. That's like the opposite of the definition of science. Science by nature is rarely, if ever, settled. It's always evolving. When someone doesn't want you to listen to the newest thinking or alternative opinions, that's, as you say, that's the tell.
Right.
Over history, a lot of things that turned out to be true were the things forwarded or pushed by a very small number or even a single scientist that everybody else shouted down and said, don't listen to them. And then that turned out to be the thing that was true. So the notion that there's some prevailing opinion or the scientific consensus, like all of that, right, is just language that should tell you there's something else out there that you should be looking at.
How many books have you written?
5.
And they range from media bias to science. Is there a common theme that runs through them that makes you want to write a book?
Yeah, I mean, I think the common theme is they all have, whether we're talking about politics or the first book was sort of why I left Stonewall. Second book, technically, the first one was a textbook. Stonewall was about why I left CBS, the bias that's going on in the background about various issues, the spying on me that started under the Obama administration by the FBI into my computers. It's always about corruption and the attempts to manipulate the public image or the public's impression of some kind of topic. The last one, Follow the Science, is the first book that tackles not just in a media-centric way, although it has a lot of anecdotes and information about media coverage. It's the first one that kind of branches out to general scientific corruption and fraud. That was the idea of HarperCollins, my publisher, that thought, that's something we need to apply the Sharyl Attkisson pen to, was this post-COVID climate and why, we've never spent so much money on insurance and doctors and healthcare, but we've never been sicker from the standpoint of chronic diseases, as if the public health officials haven't even noticed what's going on under their noses. So that book's a little different, but the common theme is this sort of corruption and attempt to manipulate the media and the images that the public get.
Do you enjoy the process of writing?
Love it. I thought everybody did when I was young, and I realize now there are writers, there are artists, there are, everybody's got their favorite things. Some people hate to sit down and write. It's cathartic for me. If I have nothing else to do and I'm bored, I want to write something. Like that's a lot of fun for me. So it's not hard to write.
Where do you write?
Anywhere. The books I had to write with my full-time TV job and other stuff. I wrote on airplanes. I wrote it, at home in between writing stories for Full Measure, just anywhere, on my little MacBook Pro, I would just be writing stories, anecdotes, doing research, conducting interviews and all that stuff.
Yeah, you talked about the controversy over being spied on. And again, if it was anybody else, I would be skeptical, but I know you and your careful reporting. So when you talk about your keystrokes being covered by government, I guess it was, right? I take it much more seriously, but can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, about the time I've been covering so many controversies from pharma to green energy scandals to the Benghazi cover up under the Obama administration to the fast and furious trafficking of weapons by the Obama administration to Mexican drug cartels. I was breaking so many big stories at CBS, and I was under a lot of scrutiny and attack by the Obama White House and Big Pharma and so on. But during this time period, and I'd had over a year of anomalies of the devices in my home, anything connect to the FiOS fiber optics line, the telephones, the TV, all of my mobile phones, all of that stuff were interrupted. Verizon couldn't fix it. I never suspected it was because the government had spyware, but at some point I had two good sources that didn't know each other, separately approach me and say that the Obama administration had begun spying on Americans that would shock people the extent to which they were doing it, and that I was likely being monitored because of my work. And I said, well, what do you mean monitored? And both of them said, your computers. And I was like, it sounded crazy to me because we didn't yet know what they'd done to AP. Edward Snowden was about to come out with his revelations, but had not yet done so. So this was the first I'd heard of anything like it. But someone who tried to call me during this time period, who had connections in the intel agencies, couldn't get through on my phone because these anomalies we're discussing, came to my house, said, I can get your computer looked at by somebody. It's always constantly checked, your work computers and home computers even, for spyware and all that kind of stuff. But this government stuff doesn't show up in those kinds of searches. And he says, I can get it looked at. So he's a friend. I let him get it looked at. He connected me with somebody who connected with somebody, and quickly confirmed that software proprietary to the federal agencies was in my computer, had been monitoring me for a long time. Someone had planted 3 classified documents into the BIOS operating system of my work computer. They had been monitoring my keystrokes. They had used a BGAN satellite terminal to access. We had a lot of details. We later were able to forensically, CBS announced the intrusions publicly after some months and further investigation with independent forensics. We've been able to, through my forensic exams, have probably 7 different teams looking and unearthing more and more. We have some of the government IP addresses used. So there's no doubt this happened. But getting accountability when it's the government, they're not going to hold themselves accountable, has been impossible. So I've been suing privately for a decade with the help of a lawyer who's not taken a penny. I'm sure he spent over $1 million. But the courts are not friendly to these cases, and they basically want you to prove who at the top was responsible for this before giving you discovery that you would need to have the proof as to who was responsible. It's sort of a catch-22. Nonetheless, I did finally get a case that progressed with a whistleblower that admitted to being part of one of the operations against me and many other Americans, frankly. I'm not the only one this happened to. And I got a clerk's default. I got a win in that case against this ex-agent, who worked out of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore under Rod Rosenstein at the time, with this sort of rogue team that does this kind of dirty work. But before we could get him to testify, he disappeared. He's supposedly dead, so he couldn't testify. That happened not too long ago. And then one of the other figures he named as being part of the operation, who could have turned some evidence, is a guy that was a Secret Service agent on the team at the time, who had since gone to prison for unrelated corruption, stealing Bitcoin from a dark web operation he was involved in with the government. Once he got out of prison and we were suing him, literally the court finally let us depose him. And this convicted felon said he didn't do it. And the court literally issued an order that said she was dismissing the case against him because he said he didn't do it. I mean, this is the kind of thing you have to you're up against when you go into court and try to get some accountability.
Why do you think you were targeted?
We know they were looking at my Fast and Furious documents, from the coverage that I had done, unearthing the government operation to put assault rifles and other weapons into the hands of the Mexican drug cartels. That was maybe the biggest story in the world at one point. Certainly from the Obama standpoint, one they thought was the most damaging, as he was trying to run for re-election. But I think the monitoring was going on for so long because I think they were monitoring all the top journalists covering them, not just me. And I think they wanted to try to identify whistleblowers who were talking to us from inside the government. They wanted to have a heads up on stories that we might be doing ahead of time. And then ultimately, were they looking when they planted classified documents in my computer to possibly frame a whistleblower and charge him with certain crimes? One of the whistleblowers in Fast and Furious, the main one, told me in advance that they would try to frame him for giving me classified material, and that he needed to be very careful. He didn't give any classified material, but he knew that they would be watching him to try to, attack him any way they could. So I think there's just, if you look at it as not just me, which is why I always thought this was an important case, not because it's me, because they were doing it to so many. I think there were operations to watch a lot of top journalists doing reporting that could be damaging to the Obama administration, so that they could keep up with what was going on and what was coming in the news, and possibly frame people or get at whistleblowers, who were leaking information. Remember, there was a war on whistleblowers during this time. So the Obama administration was going after a lot of people that were inside the government telling secrets. And then they used the idea that they had to go after these people who were leaking information as the reason why they then had to spy secretly on Associated Press or spy on members of Congress what whistleblowers are talking to Congress, what whistleblowers are talking to Sharyl Attkisson. So that was the justification secretly for why they had to spy on us.
Do they have to get permission from a court to do this?
Well, in some cases they did. They got permission from the FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act courts. In some cases, though, this is done with a rogue operation that doesn't get permission. I believe that's what mine fell under, because my sources told me at the time there was no FISA wiretap application for me. So that had not been official. That's probably why ultimately the government admitted to what they did to AP and so on, but there were official court records. With me, I was told by my sources there was no wiretap application, and the timing of the long-term monitoring, I think a wiretap, they told me, typically runs 90 days. When it's approved through the court, you have to keep going back. Mine was done for much longer than that. And when I discovered it was happening, they could tell by the forensics that the people who were doing it stopped like overnight and then tried to erase their tracks in my computers, got back in to try to erase data, did successfully erase a lot of data, but we were able to recover some of it. So all those signals indicate that there was not an official wiretap for me.
If this was coming from anybody else but you, I would say you're crazy. But I know you.
I would have thought that. Trust me, I would have thought that at the time too. I learned so much about how. Here's the scary thing. Back then, we're talking again 2010, 2011, 2012. It wasn't as easy to spy on people. They had to actually insert software and do. In my case, they inserted an extra fiber optics line on the back of my house that an expert told me they could plug into, because I had Apple computers, which are a little harder for them to hack. So they could actually download data directly off the BIOS line and so on. Now everybody says it's so easy. A criminal, or the Verizon guy even, / the government, because government works with Verizon, all these companies, to have access like this. They can just go up the street and tap directly into your computer. You don't even, they don't even have to do anything hard or insert all the spyware anymore that they used to have to do. It's much simpler than it used to be.
Amazing. Well, let me wrap up by saying I know that you've also been a caregiver for quite a while here, and you have a lot of issues related to that. What has that been like for you in this season of your life?
Well, so for people to understand, my husband's ill, and dementia is a terrible disease, as I know many people out there understand from someone that they love. So it's been stressful. Obviously, he's the worst victim of it, but trying to take care of someone who's going through that and finding resources and help, and the cost of it is extraordinary. With which there isn't coverage that you think there might be. There isn't help, to the extent that you can hire help. It's difficult to find someone that's good and reliable, and those poor people from agencies are poorly paid. So sometimes they tend to be not very good quality, because the money, they're expensive, but the agency's taking most of the money. So the people that are coming to your house are not the ones that maybe are the best caregivers for your loved one. It's a tough struggle. It's very hard.
Did you have to do it with your parents as well?
No, my father passed quickly, and my stepfather, who was actually like the father to us, passed fairly quickly when he learned he had brain cancer in 2014. So I was there helping my mom the last maybe 2 months, month and a half or so, but that was fairly quick. And then my mother has been independent. She's, like I say, in her 80s, so she's still living independently at the moment.
Well, keep doing what you do, keep the bad guys on their toes, and keep the information flowing to us because we really need your reporting. So thanks for what you do.
Thanks, Mark.